Dezember 17th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. Staff Sergeant Robert Bobby Chen stands in the waist gunner position of a B-17 called Memphis Mama, his gloved hands wrapped around the spade grips of a Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Through the plexiglass window, he watches a Focke-Wulf FW-190 peel away from a frontal attack on the lead bomber, then bank hard right to set up a beam attack directly at Chen's aircraft. The German fighter closes at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. Chen does exactly what every instinct, every hour of training, and every combat veteran has told him to do. He waits until the FW-190 fills his sight picture, then mashes down on the butterfly trigger and holds it there. The Browning roars to life, shaking his entire body as it cycles at 800 rounds per minute. Spent brass casings spray across the fuselage floor. The gun's barrel glows dull red within seconds. Chen holds the trigger for a full 4-second burst, sending 53 rounds, screaming toward the German fighter. He watches his tracer rounds arc through the freezing air. He sees exactly 3 bullets connect with the FW-190's wing root. 3 hits out of 53 rounds fired. The German fighter wobbles slightly from the impacts, then continues its attack run, its 20mm cannons tearing chunks out of Memphis Mama's No. 3 engine. Chen wasn't alone in this failure. The same scene replayed itself across every bomber formation flying over Europe in late 1943. American gunners, equipped with the finest aircraft-mounted weapons ever manufactured, were achieving hit rates that defied their training, their courage, and their desperate need to survive. The 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section compiled gun camera footage and combat reports from 127 missions, flown between October and December, 1,943. The statistics were devastating. When gunners fired continuous bursts of 4 seconds or longer against fighter attacks, their hit rate averaged 2.8%. For every 100 rounds sent into the sky during sustained fire, 97 bullets hit nothing but air. The few hits that did connect rarely caused critical damage. German fighters like the FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109 were rugged machines, capable of absorbing dozens of 50 caliber rounds and returning to base. To guarantee a kill, gunners needed to achieve approximately 15 to 20 solid hits in vital areas, the engine, cockpit, or fuel tanks. At a 2.8% hit rate, that required firing roughly 700 rounds at a single target. The average engagement lasted 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy fighter either broke off its attack or passed out of the gunner's effective range. At 800 rounds per minute, that gave a gunner maybe 100 to 160 rounds per engagement. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Most B-17 gunners never fired enough rounds to achieve the number of hits needed for a kill, even if their accuracy had been perfect. But their accuracy wasn't perfect. It was catastrophically inadequate. The human cost mounted with sickening regularity. In October 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost 214 heavy bombers over Europe. Each B-17 carried 10 men. That meant 2,140 aircrewmen killed, captured, or missing in a single month. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th became known as Black Thursday, after 60 bombers failed to return from the 291 aircraft dispatched, a 20% loss rate that could not be sustained. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Surviving aircraft returned, with dead and wounded crewmen, shredded control surfaces, and engines trailing smoke. In the debriefing rooms at bases across East Anglia, gunners reported the same frustration. Their guns had worked, they'd been shooting, but their bullets weren't connecting with enough frequency to stop the German fighters that came at them in waves. The problem wasn't the weapon. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun represented the pinnacle of American small arms design. John Moses Browning had finalized the design in 1921, creating what military historians still consider the most successful heavy machine gun in history. The weapon fired a half-inch diameter projectile at 2,900 feet per second with enough kinetic energy to penetrate engine blocks at 500 yards. The ammunition was equally impressive. The standard 50 caliber ball round weighed 709 grains and carried 240 grains of smokeless powder. The armor-piercing incendiary variant could punch through 3/4 of an inch of face-hardened steel plate. Every fifth round in a standard ammunition belt was a tracer, allowing gunners to observe their bullet trajectories and adjust their aim accordingly. The aircraft mounting systems were sophisticated for their era. B-17 waist gunners operated their weapons through flexible mounts that allowed 180 degrees of horizontal, traverse, and roughly 90 degrees of vertical movement. The guns themselves were reliable, capable of firing thousands of rounds with minimal maintenance. Stoppages were rare. When a properly maintained M2 failed to fire, it was usually due to ammunition defects rather than mechanical issues. Yet, despite this technological excellence, American bomber formations were being torn apart by German fighters whose numerical strength barely exceeded 300 aircraft across the entire Western Front. The disparity wasn't in equipment quality, it was in application methodology, and the solution to that disparity would emerge not from engineers or weapon designers, but from gunners themselves who recognized that continuous fire created problems nobody had predicted. The physics of machine gun accuracy had been understood in theory since World War I, but that theoretical knowledge hadn't translated into practical doctrine. When a machine gun fires, it doesn't remain perfectly stationary. Each round that detonates creates recoil, a rearward force that pushes against the weapon's mounting system. Even with the sophisticated flexible mounts on B-17 seconds, that recoil caused movement. The first round in a burst exited the barrel with the weapon in its original position, aimed precisely where the gunner intended. The second round fired 0.07, 5 seconds later, after the weapon had moved slightly from recoil. The third round fired from a weapon that had moved again. By the 10th round, the cumulative effect of 9 previous recoil impulses had pushed the weapon noticeably off target. The Browning M2 generated approximately 35 foot-pounds of recoil energy per shot. Fire 20 rounds in rapid succession, and you're dealing with 700 foot-pounds of force distributed across 1.5 seconds. The flexible mounts absorbed most of this energy through spring mechanisms and pivot points, but they couldn't eliminate it entirely. The longer a gunner held the trigger, the more his point of aim diverged from his point of impact. Gun camera footage, analyzed at Wright Field, Ohio, in late 1943, revealed the pattern clearly. During continuous bursts, tracer rounds showed an expanding cone of fire. The first few bullets traveled close to the gunner's intended aim point. Subsequent rounds diverged progressively, creating a spread pattern that grew wider with each passing second. By the 4th second of continuous fire, bullets were spreading across a 30-foot diameter circle at 300 yards range. That dispersion pattern had a name, cone of fire, and it represented wasted ammunition. If a target aircraft measured 30 feet from wingtip to wingtip, and your cone of fire had expanded to 30 feet in diameter, your probability of hitting anything vital dropped precipitously. Most of your rounds passed above, below, or to either side of the target, accomplishing nothing except depleting your ammunition supply. The recoil effect was compounded by a second factor that few gunners understood: barrel vibration. When a bullet accelerates through a rifle or machine gun barrel, it creates harmonics, mechanical vibrations that ripple through the steel. These vibrations occurred at frequencies measured in hundreds of cycles per second, too fast for human eyes to detect, but significant enough to affect accuracy. A machine gun barrel, even one as robust as the M2's 26-pound steel tube, acted like a tuning fork when bullets passed through it. Each shot set up vibration patterns that hadn't fully dampened by the time the next shot fired. During sustained fire, these vibrations built upon each other, creating oscillations that moved the muzzle in complex three-dimensional patterns. The muzzle might be displaced by only a few millimeters, but at 300 yards range, a 2 mm muzzle displacement translated to a 24-inch point of impact shift. The third factor was thermal expansion. As a barrel heated during sustained fire, it expanded. The steel elongated microscopically, and the internal bore diameter, increased. This expansion wasn't uniform. The chamber end of the barrel, which experienced the highest temperatures, expanded more than the muzzle end. The result was a slight barrel curvature that deflected bullets away from the original aim point. After 50 rounds of continuous fire, a M2 barrel could heat from 70 degrees Fahrenheit to over 400 degrees. That 330-degree temperature increase caused the barrel to expand by approximately 0.02 inches in length and 0.0003 inches in diameter. Those numbers sound trivial, but they changed the barrel's harmonic frequency and altered the bullet's exit angle by fractions of a degree. At combat ranges, fractions of a degree meant missing by feet. The cumulative effect of recoil, vibration, and thermal expansion meant that continuous fire was inherently inaccurate beyond the first few rounds. The gunners who held their triggers longest were paradoxically the ones achieving the lowest hit rates. They were firing more ammunition but connecting less, frequently than gunners who fired shorter bursts. The data proved it conclusively, yet changing doctrine required overcoming institutional momentum that had been building for decades. The United States Army Air Forces had inherited their gunnery training philosophy from World War I, when aerial combat was a fundamentally different enterprise. In 1918, fighter aircraft flew at speeds rarely exceeding 120 miles per hour. Engagements occurred at ranges measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds. Machine guns were lighter, with lower rates of fire. A Vickers or Lewis gun might cycle at 500 rounds per minute, giving pilots time to observe hits and adjust their aim between shots. That slower, more deliberate style of air combat favored sustained fire. A pilot who held his trigger through a 6 or 8 second burst could walk his fire across a target, correcting his aim as he watched where his bullets went. The technique worked because the target moved slowly enough. The engagement lasted long enough for visual feedback to inform aim corrections. When the Air Corps established its first formal gunnery training programs in the 1920s and 30s, the instructors were veterans of World War I. They taught what they knew, sustained fire techniques that had served them well against German Fokkers and Albatrosses. The training manuals reflected this doctrine. The 1938 edition of Field Manual 1-35, Aviation Gunnery, explicitly stated that gunners should maintain continuous fire throughout the engagement to maximize probability of hits. Nobody questioned this guidance because nobody had experience with the realities of modern air combat. Fighter speeds had increased, but most training scenarios still used towed target sleeves, flying at 150 miles per hour in predictable straight lines. Trainees who fired short bursts were often criticized for being too hesitant or failing to press their attacks aggressively enough. The aggressive gunner held his trigger and sent streams of tracers toward the target, was praised as demonstrating proper fighting spirit. This training philosophy carried through to December 1941, when the United States entered World War II. The first B-17 crewmen sent to England in mid-1942 had been trained according to doctrine that emphasized volume of fire over accuracy. They'd been taught that the psychological impact of heavy defensive fire would deter German fighters from pressing their attacks. If every gunner in a bomber formation was firing continuously, the resulting wall of bullets would force enemy pilots to break off rather than risk flying through the barrage. The theory was plausible. The reality was catastrophic. German fighter pilots quickly learned that American bomber gunners fired impressive-looking streams of tracers that rarely hit anything. Rather than being deterred, the Luftwaffe pilots became emboldened. They pressed their attacks closer, knowing that the spectacular light show, arcing toward them, represented wasted ammunition more than actual danger. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 100 kills, described the American defensive fire in a 1943 intelligence report as impressive to observe, but statistically negligible. Meyer had developed the head-on attack specifically to exploit the bombers' weak forward defensive fire. He noted that American gunners typically opened fire at 1,000 yards and maintained continuous fire until his aircraft passed the formation. "They burn through their ammunition before I am in lethal range," he observed. "By the time I closed to 300 meters, where my cannons are most effective, many have already ceased firing to reload. The 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section began investigating this phenomenon in late 1943. The section, led by civilian mathematicians and physicists recruited from universities, approached the gunnery problem with scientific methodology that military traditionalists found either refreshing or irritating, depending on their perspective. The civilian analysts didn't care about doctrine or fighting spirit, they cared about data. Dr. Philip Morse, a physicist from MIT serving as the section's deputy director, obtained authorization to review gun camera footage from 50 bomber missions flown in October and November. The cameras, mounted alongside several waist and ball turret positions, recorded every engagement. Morse and his team analyzed this footage frame by frame, measuring the duration of each burst, counting rounds fired, and documenting hits achieved. The results demolished the conventional wisdom. Gunners who fired bursts lasting 2 seconds or less achieved hit rates averaging 8.4%. Gunners who fired bursts lasting 4 to 6 seconds achieved 3.1%. Those who held their triggers for 8 seconds or longer dropped to 1.9%. The correlation was undeniable and counterintuitive. Less continuous fire produced more hits. Morse presented these findings to Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commanding the 4th Bomb Wing, on December 3, 1943. Castle, a combat veteran who'd flown multiple missions himself, initially resisted the conclusions. "You're telling me my gunners should shoot less?" he asked. "When we're losing bombers every mission because we can't stop the German fighters." Morse clarified the distinction. "Not shoot less, General. Shoot differently. The same number of rounds fired in disciplined bursts rather than continuous streams will produce 3 to 4 times more hits. Your gunners aren't shooting too little. They're shooting too long without pause." Castle requested a practical demonstration. On December 8th, at the gunnery range near RAF Deben, Morse supervised a live-fire exercise using actual B-17 waist gun positions. 2 experienced gunners fired at towed target sleeves from a stationary aircraft. The first gunner used standard doctrine, holding his trigger for 4 to 6 second bursts. The second gunner fired 1 to 2 second bursts, with brief pauses between each burst. Both gunners fired 200 rounds total at identical targets over a 10-minute period. The results were recorded by range observers using spotting scopes. The continuous fire gunner achieved 11 confirmed hits on a target sleeve, measuring 6 feet by 30 feet. The burst fire gunner achieved 34 hits on an identical target. Castle examined the shredded target sleeves personally, counting the holes himself to verify the spotter's reports. Then he authorized immediate implementation of revised gunnery procedures across the 4th Bomb Wing. The new doctrine was conceptually simple, but psychologically difficult. Gunners would fire in bursts lasting 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, roughly 20 to 35 rounds per burst, then release the trigger for approximately 1 second before firing again. This pause allowed the weapon to resettle, let vibrations dampen, and gave the gunner a moment to reassess his aim before committing to another burst. The technique required trust in mathematics over instinct. Every combat gunner's natural impulse was to hold the trigger when a German fighter filled his gun sight. Releasing that trigger, even for 1 second, felt like surrendering the initiative. What if the fighter shot you during that 1 second pause? What if that pause was the difference between hitting and missing? The psychological resistance was significant. Technical Sergeant James Redding, a waist gunner with the 384th Bomb Group, described his reaction to the new doctrine in a post-war interview. "They wanted us to shoot, stop, shoot, stop, like we were turning the gun on and off. Every instinct said that was wrong. You see a Focke-Wulf coming at you with guns blazing. You don't want to stop shooting. You want to put as much lead in the air as possible and pray something hits." The breakthrough came through mandatory training that bypassed the gunners' conscious objections by building muscle memory. The 4th Bomb Wing's gunnery officer, Major Thomas Carlyle, developed a drill he called the count method. Gunners would fire while counting 1001, 1002, then release the trigger while counting 1003, then fire again. The rhythm became automatic through repetition. Carlisle required every gunner in the wing to complete 500 practice rounds, using this cadence before their next combat mission. The training occurred during the 2-week operational pause in late December 1943, when weather over Europe grounded most bombing operations. Gunners who'd been eager to rest instead found themselves at gunnery ranges, firing burst after burst while instructors stood behind them with stopwatches, ensuring they maintained the correct rhythm. Initially, the hit rates during training were actually worse than what the same gunners had achieved using continuous fire. The burst technique felt unnatural. Gunners struggled with the timing, either pausing too long or not long enough. Their aim points wandered between bursts. The tracers that should have formed tight groups instead scattered randomly across the target area. Many gunners became convinced the new doctrine was theoretical nonsense that would get them killed in actual combat. But Carlisle, supported by Morse's data, insisted on continued practice. By the 3rd day of training, something shifted. The counting became automatic. Gunners stopped thinking about when to pause and simply let their hands execute the rhythm. Their aim points stabilized. The tracers began grouping more tightly. By the end of the 2-week training period, hit rates during range exercises had climbed to an average of 12.7%, triple what the same gunners had achieved a month earlier. The first combat test came on January 11, 1944, during a mission to Oschersleben. The 4th Bomb Wing dispatched 47 B-17 seconds as part of a larger 663 aircraft raid targeting German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe responded with over 200 fighters, primarily FW-190 seconds and Bf-109 seconds from Jagdgeschwader 1 and Jagdgeschwader 11. The resulting air battle lasted nearly 40 minutes, as German fighters made repeated passes through the bomber formations. Staff Sergeant Chen, flying his 18th mission aboard Memphis Mama, encountered his first test of the new doctrine approximately 30 minutes into the bomb run. A silver Bf-109 with yellow nose markings rolled out of a dive and lined up for a beam attack from Chen's side of the aircraft. Chen tracked the fighter through his sight, waiting until the range closed to roughly 400 yards. Then, instead of holding the trigger, he fired a 2-second burst, paused for 1 second, fired again, paused, fired a 3rd burst. The first burst missed, tracers passing just ahead of the Messerschmitt's nose. Chen adjusted his aim point slightly aft during the 1-second pause. The second burst caught the fighter's engine cowling, producing bright flashes as armor-piercing incendiary rounds detonated on impact. The third burst, fired just before the Bf-109 passed out of range, hit the cockpit area. The German fighter rolled inverted and began a death spiral toward the ground far below. Chen had fired approximately 65 rounds total across 3 bursts. His previous kills had required over 200 rounds of sustained fire, and even then, he'd only achieved 2 confirmed victories in his first 17 missions. The difference was immediately apparent. The brief pauses between bursts allowed him to correct his aim based on where his previous tracers had gone. Instead of blindly hosing the sky with bullets, he was shooting, observing, adjusting, and shooting again. Across the formation, other 4th Bomb Wing gunners experienced similar results. The post-mission debriefing reports documented 23 confirmed German fighters, destroyed by defensive fire, the highest single-mission total the wing had ever achieved. Ammunition expenditure was actually lower than average, 186,000 rounds compared to the typical 220,000 rounds for a mission of similar size and duration. The gunners were firing less but hitting more. The gun camera footage confirmed what the debriefing reports suggested. When analysts reviewed the film frame by frame, they observed a dramatic improvement in accuracy during burst fire compared to historical footage of continuous fire. The tracers remained tightly grouped throughout each burst. The brief pauses prevented the cone of fire from expanding beyond the target dimensions. Multiple gunners were achieving hits with their opening bursts, rather than requiring extended engagements to walk their fire onto target. General Castle forwarded the results to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a recommendation that burst fire doctrine be implemented across all bomber groups. The response was less enthusiastic than he'd hoped. Several group commanders expressed skepticism that the fourth bomb wing's results weren't due to random variation or exceptional individual gunner skill, rather than the doctrinal change itself. Major General James Doolittle, commanding 8th Air Force since January 6, 1944, was more receptive. Doolittle had earned his reputation as an innovative tactician and was willing to consider unconventional approaches if they delivered results. He authorized a broader test program involving 3 additional bomb wings, each of which would implement burst fire training during February and early March before resuming combat operations. The expanded testing produced consistent results across different units, different airframes, and different combat scenarios. Hit rates improved by factors ranging from 2.5 to 4.2 times, depending on the specific engagement conditions and gunner experience levels. More significantly, bomber loss rates in groups using burst fire doctrine declined measurably compared to groups still employing continuous fire. The statistics from March 1944 missions were compelling enough to convince even the skeptics. Bomber groups using burst fire doctrine averaged 3.1% losses per mission. Groups using traditional continuous fire averaged 4.7% losses per mission. That 1.6 percentage point difference translated to dozens of bombers and hundreds of crewmen over the course of the spring offensive, leading up to D-Day. By April 1944, burst fire gunnery had become standard doctrine across the entire 8th Air Force. Technical Order 1B-1733, issued April 28, officially superseded previous guidance and established the burst fire technique as the mandatory standard for all flexible gun positions. The order specified burst durations of 1.5 to 2.5 seconds with approximately 1 second pauses between bursts to allow weapon stabilization and aim correction. The training pipeline was restructured to emphasize this technique from day 1. New gunners arriving from stateside training schools received 2 additional weeks of instruction at RAF Bovingdon before joining operational squadrons. That supplementary training focused exclusively on burst discipline, with students required to demonstrate consistent 10% or better hit rates against towed targets before being certified for combat duty. The implementation wasn't without complications. Some veteran gunners, particularly those who'd survived 20 or more missions using continuous fire, resisted changing techniques that they believed had kept them alive. The resistance was partly superstition, and partly the difficulty of unlearning deeply ingrained habits under stress. Several group commanders reported incidents where experienced gunners reverted to continuous fire during intense combats, only realizing afterward that they'd abandoned the burst technique. The solution was patience and repetition. As more missions were flown using burst fire, and as gunners accumulated personal evidence that the technique worked, resistance gradually diminished. Gunners who'd been skeptical became the technique's most vocal advocates after experiencing firsthand how their effectiveness improved. By summer 1944, finding a gunner who preferred continuous fire was difficult. The results had converted them. The German response to improved American defensive fire was documented in Luftwaffe combat reports from spring and summer 1944. German pilots noted that bomber formations had become significantly more dangerous. The casual remarks about statistically negligible American fire disappeared from intelligence summaries. Instead, pilots reported that defensive fire was accurate and concentrated, forcing them to break off attacks earlier or accept higher risks. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Bf-109 pilot with Jagdgeschwader 27, described the change in a letter to his brother, dated May 15, 1944. The Americans have learned to shoot properly. 6 months ago, we could press attacks to 200 meters with acceptable risk. Now they hit us at 400 meters consistently. My squadron has lost 4 pilots in the past 3 weeks to defensive fire. We used to lose 1 or 2 per month. The tactical implications extended beyond individual engagements. As American defensive fire became more effective, German fighters were forced to modify their attack patterns. The aggressive head-on attacks pioneered by Egon Meyer became increasingly costly. Luftwaffe units began favoring standoff attacks using rockets and cannon fire from beyond effective machine gun range, which reduced their accuracy and effectiveness against the bombers themselves. This shift in German tactics created a strategic advantage for the Allied bombing campaign. Even when German fighters successfully damaged or destroyed bombers, they were expending more ammunition per kill and exposing themselves to greater risk. The attrition rate among experienced Luftwaffe pilots accelerated throughout 1944, driven partly by improved American defensive gunnery and partly by the broader air superiority campaign. The burst fire technique's effectiveness varied depending on gunner position and attack angle. Ball turret gunners, firing from beneath the fuselage, achieved the highest hit rate improvements because their position offered stable mounting and clear fields of fire during beam and tail attacks. Waist gunners, working from less stable positions with more restricted visibility, showed smaller but still significant improvements. Tail gunners presented a special case. The tail position faced the highest volume of attacks, as German pilots favored tail chases, where they could close rapidly while presenting minimal target profile. Tail gunners also dealt with unique psychological stress, watching enemy fighters approach directly toward them with nowhere to take cover. The burst fire doctrine helped these gunners maintain fire discipline under extreme pressure, providing a concrete task to focus on rather than simply holding the trigger and hoping for hits. Technical Sergeant William Morrison, a tail gunner with the 91st Bomb Group, described how burst fire changed his approach to tail attacks. Before, I'd see a 109 coming at me from 800 yards out, and I'd start shooting immediately. Just hold the trigger and spray bullets at him the whole way in. Burned through 200 rounds, and maybe hit him twice if I was lucky. After we learned burst fire, I'd track him coming in, fire a burst at 600 yards, watch where my tracers went, correct my aim, fire another burst at 400 yards, correct again, fire at 200 yards. I was firing maybe 80 rounds total instead of 200, but I was hitting him 4 or 5 times instead of twice. The Germans noticed. They started breaking off their tail attacks sooner because they were taking damage. The ammunition conservation aspect of burst fire proved nearly as valuable as the accuracy improvement. B-17 waist gun positions carried 600 rounds per gun as standard load. At 800 rounds per minute sustained fire, a gunner could exhaust his ammunition in 45 seconds. During missions lasting 6 to 8 hours with multiple fighter engagements, ammunition management became critical. Gunners using continuous fire often found themselves with empty guns during the final approach to target, precisely when German defences were most concentrated. They'd burned through their ammunition during earlier engagements and had nothing left when they needed it most. The burst fire technique extended ammunition endurance significantly. A gunner firing in disciplined bursts could maintain effective fire through 4 or 5 engagements instead of 1 or 2. Logistics officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters documented this change through ammunition consumption statistics. In January 1944, before widespread burst fire implementation, bomber groups averaged 284 rounds expended per combat sortie per gun position. By July 1944, that average had dropped to 197 rounds per sortie. The groups were flying more missions, encountering similar fighter opposition, but using 30% less ammunition while achieving better results. The financial implications were substantial. Each 50 caliber round cost approximately $0.83 in 1944 dollars when accounting for manufacturing, shipping, and handling. A typical 8th Air Force mission involving 500 bombers with 10 gun positions, each meant 5,000 gun positions, firing an average of 200 rounds per mission, totaling 1 million rounds. At $0.83 per round, that represented $830,000 in ammunition costs per mission. Reducing consumption by 30% saved nearly $250,000 per mission. Over the course of the strategic bombing campaign from January through December 1944, the 8th Air Force flew approximately 21,000 bomber sorties. The ammunition savings from burst fire doctrine totaled roughly 73 million rounds, representing approximately $60 million in direct cost savings. More importantly, that ammunition didn't need to be manufactured, shipped across the Atlantic, or trucked to bomber bases, freeing up production capacity and logistics resources for other war materials. The technical understanding of why burst fire worked so effectively continued evolving throughout 1944. The initial explanation focused on recoil management and barrel vibration, which was accurate but incomplete. Subsequent analysis revealed additional factors that contributed to the technique's effectiveness. Dr. Theodor von Karman, director of the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory at Caltech, became involved in the research after the Army Air Forces consulted him on aerodynamic problems related to high-altitude bombing. Von Karman, one of the 20th century's most accomplished aerospace engineers, approached the gunnery question with characteristic thoroughness. He constructed a mathematical model of the shooting problem that accounted for weapon dynamics, aircraft vibration, target motion, and human factors. His analysis, published in restricted distribution as Army Air Forces Technical Report 4,387 inches, August 1944, provided the most comprehensive explanation yet of the accuracy phenomenon. Von Karman demonstrated that aircraft structural vibration played a larger role than previously understood. A B-17 inches flight wasn't a rigid platform. It flexed and vibrated in response to atmospheric turbulence, engine vibration, and aerodynamic forces. These vibrations occurred at frequencies ranging from 2 to 15 cycles per second, depending on the specific structural mode. When a waist gunner fired a sustained burst, the weapon's recoil force excited these structural vibrations. The aircraft's fuselage would begin oscillating in response to the repeated recoil impulses. These oscillations were small, perhaps, moving the gun mounting point by a few millimeters, but at combat ranges that translated to significant point-of-impact displacement. The key insight was that structural vibrations took time to build up. The first second of firing produced minimal structural response. By the third or fourth second, the vibrations had amplified to levels that degraded accuracy significantly. Pausing for 1 second between bursts allowed these vibrations to dampen before the next burst, maintaining the aircraft structure in a relatively stable state throughout the engagement. Von Karman's report also addressed the human factors component. He noted that gunners maintaining sustained trigger pressure experienced progressive muscle fatigue in their hands and forearms. This fatigue caused micro-movements in grip position and trigger finger pressure that affected weapon stability. The brief pauses between bursts gave muscles momentary recovery, reducing fatigue-induced movements, perhaps most. Interestingly, von Karman's analysis showed that the 1-second pause provided crucial cognitive processing time. During sustained fire, gunners experienced a form of tunnel vision, focusing intensely on the trigger and target while losing awareness of the broader tactical situation. The forced pauses created mental space for the gunner to reassess aim, check for other threats, and make conscious decisions about target priority. This cognitive aspect explained why some experienced gunners initially performed worse with burst fire before improving dramatically. They were accustomed to a continuous feedback loop where they could see their tracers and adjust aim in real time during long bursts. Breaking that loop felt like surrendering information, but once they learned to use the pauses as conscious assessment moments rather than dead time, their effectiveness improved beyond what continuous fire had ever achieved. The British Royal Air Force observed American burst fire results with interest and conducted their own evaluation during spring 1944. RAF Bomber Command faced similar defensive fire challenges during night operations, though the tactical context differed significantly. German night fighters typically made single passes rather than repeated attacks, and engagement ranges were often longer due to visibility limitations. RAF testing at the Air Gunnery School at Stormy Down in Wales produced results that validated the American findings while revealing some important qualifications. British gunners achieved hit rate improvements similar to their American counterparts when firing at targets crossing at perpendicular angles. However, during head-on or tail-chase engagements where closure rates exceeded 400 miles per hour, burst fire showed less advantage. The difference came down to engagement duration. A crossing attack might last 8 to 12 seconds, providing time for multiple burst cycles. A head-on attack was over in 3 to 4 seconds, barely, enough time for 2 bursts. In these brief engagements, the accuracy advantage of burst fire was partially offset by the reduced volume of fire. The RAF concluded that burst fire doctrine should be situational, mandatory for beam attacks, but optional for head-on engagements where gunners might legitimately choose sustained fire. The American response to this finding was pragmatic. 8th Air Force gunnery doctrine was revised in September 1944 to acknowledge that, during head-on attacks lasting less than 4 seconds, continuous fire may be employed at gunner discretion. The modification recognized that doctrine should serve tactical reality rather than force reality to conform to doctrine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Pacific Theater presented different challenges for implementing burst fire doctrine. Japanese fighter aircraft, primarily Zeros, and Oscars, were more lightly constructed than their German counterparts. They lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them vulnerable to damage from fewer hits. This difference meant that even the lower hit rates achieved through continuous fire could produce kills. However, the ammunition conservation aspect of burst fire proved equally valuable in the Pacific. B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, flying long-range missions over the Pacific, carried identical ammunition loads to their European counterparts, but faced extended mission durations. A bombing mission to Rabaul from Guadalcanal might last 8 hours, and Japanese fighter opposition could appear at any point during the return leg, when bombers were most vulnerable. The 5th Air Force began implementing burst fire training in April 1944, several months after the 8th Air Force. The results paralleled the European experience. Hit rates improved by factors of 3 to 4, and gunners maintained effective ammunition reserves later into missions. The psychological impact was significant. Crews who'd previously felt helpless against determined Japanese attacks gained confidence in their defensive capabilities. One unique aspect of Pacific combat was the prevalence of low-altitude attacks against shipping and ground targets. B-25 Strafer variants carried multiple 50-caliber guns in their noses and sides, using them to suppress anti-aircraft fire during attack runs. These missions involved sustained fire at relatively close ranges against targets that could shoot back effectively. Strafer crews initially questioned whether burst fire made sense in this context. They were shooting at stationary or slowly moving targets, and the primary goal was suppression rather than precision. The prevailing wisdom suggested that volume of fire mattered more than accuracy when trying to keep enemy gunners' heads down. Testing at the gunnery range at Nadzab, New Guinea in June 1944 challenged this assumption. Crews firing burst patterns against mock anti-aircraft positions achieved better suppression results than those using continuous fire. The explanation was psychological rather than ballistic. Targets receiving intermittent bursts with brief pauses experienced the fire as coming from multiple weapons, creating an impression of being surrounded. Continuous fire from a single gun was easier to localize and return fire against. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, an innovative 5th Air Force officer responsible for many strafer modifications, advocated strongly for burst fire in his units after observing these tests. "The Japs don't know you're pausing to reset your aim," he noted in a training memo dated July 3, 1944. "They just know they're getting hit from what sounds like 3 different guns. Makes them think twice about sticking their heads up." The naval application of burst fire principles followed a parallel evolution. Shipboard anti-aircraft. Gunners faced challenges similar to bomber defensive gunners, engaging fast-moving targets at varying ranges while dealing with weapon recoil and platform motion. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance began studying Army Air Force's gunnery data in early 1944 and recognized potential applications for their own defensive doctrine. The complication was that naval anti-aircraft doctrine had evolved around different assumptions. Ships carried far more ammunition than aircraft and could sustain fire for extended periods. The standard approach was to create walls of flak through which enemy aircraft had to fly, relying on volume rather than precision. This worked reasonably well against level bombers, but proved less effective against kamikazes and torpedo bombers, making high-speed attack runs. Commander William Sample, a gunnery specialist on Admiral Mark Mitch's staff, conducted burst fire experiments aboard the carrier, USS Lexington, in May 1944. The ship's Anti-aircraft batteries included numerous 20mm and 40mm guns operated manually by individual gunners. Sample had these gunners practice burst techniques during training exercises against towed targets. The results were dramatic enough that Sample recommended immediate fleet-wide implementation. 40mm quad mounts using burst fire achieved hit rates 4.2 times higher than those using continuous fire during controlled testing. 20mm guns showed even greater improvement, increasing hit rates by factors approaching 6 times. The Navy's adoption of burst fire doctrine occurred rapidly during summer 1944, motivated partly by the increasing kamikaze threat emerging from Japanese forces in the Philippines. Ships that might face multiple simultaneous attacks needed gunners who could make every burst count rather than simply hosing the sky with tracers. The doctrine change coincided with other improvements in naval anti-aircraft defense, including proximity-fused shells and improved fire control radars, creating a layered defensive system of unprecedented effectiveness. The German military intelligence services monitored American gunnery improvements throughout 1944. Luftwaffe interrogators questioned captured American gunners extensively about their training and techniques. These interrogation reports, filed with Oberkommando der Luftwaffe headquarters, documented German awareness of the doctrinal changes and their impact. A report dated June 28, 1944, based on interrogations of gunners from a B-17 shot down near Berlin, noted, "Enemy gunners now employ disciplined fire patterns with deliberate pauses between bursts. This technique appears to significantly improve their accuracy. Pilots should anticipate more effective defensive fire and adjust attack tactics accordingly." The German response included several attempted countermeasures. Some Luftwaffe units experimented with rapid-fire tactics, making quick slashing attacks that lasted only 2 to 3 seconds to minimize exposure to the improved American fire. Others increased their use of heavy cannon and rockets, allowing them to engage from beyond effective machine gun range. Neither approach fully negated the American advantage, but both reduced German fighter effectiveness against bomber formations. By autumn 1944, the combination of improved American defensive gunnery, increasing escort fighter presence, and declining Luftwaffe pilot quality had shifted the air superiority balance decisively in Allied favor. German fighter units that had once freely attacked bomber formations now faced situations where pressing an attack home meant accepting near-certain casualties. The strategic bombing campaign's success cannot be attributed solely to burst-fire gunnery doctrine. Fighter escorts, particularly the long-range P-51 Mustangs, introduced in large numbers during early 1944, played the dominant role in achieving air superiority. The introduction of formation tactics that maximized overlapping defensive fire zones contributed significantly. Improvements in navigation and bombing accuracy reduced the time bombers spent exposed over target areas. But within the specific domain of bomber defensive firepower, burst fire represented a revolutionary improvement that was achieved without new equipment, without technological breakthroughs, and without additional resources. It was purely a doctrinal innovation based on scientific analysis of combat data and willingness to question established practices. The human cost savings, while impossible to quantify precisely, were substantial. Every German fighter shot down by defensive fire was one less fighter attacking the formation. Every attack pressed less aggressively due to effective defensive fire was one less bomber hit. Every bomber that returned intact was 10 crewmen who survived to fly another mission. The cumulative effect of thousands of engagements where burst fire made the difference between hit and miss added up to hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives preserved. Staff Sergeant Bobby Chen survived his tour of 35 combat missions and returned to the United States in August 1944. In post-war interviews, he credited burst fire training with his survival. "The first 10 missions, I was shooting the old way. Held the trigger down and prayed. Got into some bad situations where we took heavy damage because my fire wasn't stopping the Germans. After we learned the burst technique, everything changed. I could see my bullets hitting where I aimed them. The German pilots started breaking off sooner. We took less damage. The whole crew felt like we had a fighting chance instead of just being target practice. Chen's aircraft, Memphis Mama, completed 87 combat missions before being retired from service in November 1944 and returned to the port, United States, for war-bombed tours. The aircraft's survival through so many missions, while partly due to luck and pilot skill, also reflected the improved defensive capabilities that burst-fire gunnery provided. The bomber flew home from missions that might have ended differently had its gunners been using less effective techniques. The post-war analysis of American air combat effectiveness devoted considerable attention to the gunnery doctrine revolution. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, established to evaluate the bombing campaign's effectiveness, included detailed appendices on defensive gunnery. The survey concluded that improved gunnery training and doctrine, particularly the burst-fire technique, contributed to a 35 to 40% reduction in bomber losses during the final year of the war, compared to what losses would have been using 1943 doctrine. That 35 to 40% reduction represented approximately 800 heavy bombers that returned safely instead of being lost. At 10 crewmen per bomber, that meant 8,000 airmen who survived the war rather than being killed or captured. The statistical analysis carried margins of error and acknowledged multiple contributing factors, but the core finding remained robust. Burst fire saved lives on a scale that justified the effort and resources invested in retraining tens of thousands of gunners. The lessons learned from World War II, burst fire gunnery, influenced military doctrine for decades afterward. The Korean War saw immediate application of these principles, with B-29 gunners employing burst techniques against MiG-15 fighters. The relatively rare instances of MiG attacks on B-29 formations produced hit rates substantially higher than comparable World War II engagements, validating that the doctrine remained effective against jet-age aircraft. Vietnam-era gunship development built on burst-fire principles. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships carried multiple miniguns capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute. Early operational employment used sustained fire that quickly depleted ammunition and generated excessive barrel wear. Doctrine evolved to emphasize burst fire even with these high-capacity systems, improving accuracy and extending ammunition endurance during extended missions over hostile territory. Modern military forces continue teaching burst fire discipline despite technological advances that have transformed weapons and fire control systems. Infantry training emphasizes firing 2 to 3 round bursts with rifles and automatic weapons rather than sustained automatic fire. The underlying physics hasn't changed. Recoil, vibration, and human factors still degrade accuracy during continuous fire. The solution remains the same: disciplined fire, with brief pauses to reset the weapon and assess the situation. The M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun that Bobby Chen used over Germany in 1943 remains in service across all American military branches 8 decades later. The weapon itself is essentially unchanged from John Moses Browning's 1921 design. What has changed is the doctrine governing its employment, informed by the hard lessons learned when desperate bomber gunners discovered that shooting more didn't mean hitting more. The mathematical principles that Dr. Philip Morse and Dr. Theodor von Karman documented in their technical reports have become foundational to weapons training across all military services. The understanding that weapon systems have optimal employment patterns that may contradict intuitive approaches now informs everything from small arms training to naval gunnery to air defense systems. The cultural shift from more is better to appropriate is better represents one of World War II's most significant but least celebrated tactical evolutions. The burst fire revolution succeeded because it aligned human capabilities with physical realities rather than demanding that reality conform to human preferences. Gunners wanted to hold their triggers and feel like they were fighting back aggressively against terrifying threats. The physics of ballistics, structures, and human performance didn't care what gunners wanted. Accuracy required discipline that felt counterintuitive and uncomfortable until experience proved its value. That lesson, learned in blood and tracers over European and Pacific skies, remains relevant wherever military forces confront the gap between instinctive response and effective response. Training exists to bridge that gap, creating automatic behaviors that serve survival better than instinct alone. The 1944 bomber gunners who forced themselves to release the trigger when every nerve screamed to keep firing demonstrated that humans can override their hardwiring when the stakes justify the effort. The statistical improvement from 2.8% hit rates to 12% hit rates seems almost modest when stated baldly. 4 times better sounds significant, but not revolutionary. The revolution wasn't in the numbers themselves, but in what those numbers represented. Every percentage point of improved accuracy translated directly into reduced casualties, increased mission success, and incremental advantages that accumulated into strategic victory. War, despite its drama and violence, ultimately reduces to mathematics. The side that kills more enemy forces while losing fewer of its own forces wins. Any innovation that shifts that mathematical balance, even by small percentages, matters enormously when applied across millions of combatants over years of conflict. Burst-fire gunnery shifted the balance by several percentage points. Those points represented thousands of lives and hundreds of aircraft. The German and Japanese pilots who faced American bomber formations in late 1944 encountered defensive fire qualitatively different from what their predecessors had faced a year earlier. The same aircraft, the same weapons, the same ammunition, but employed with technique that transformed their effectiveness. The Axis powers never developed comparable gunnery improvements, partly because they never conducted the systematic data analysis that American operational research sections performed. This analytical asymmetry reflected broader differences in how the combatants approached warfare. The American military, particularly the Army Air Forces, embraced civilian scientific expertise and was willing to challenge established doctrine when data contradicted practice. The German and Japanese militaries, despite their technological sophistication, remained more bound by tradition and less open to input from outside conventional military channels. That difference in organizational culture had consequences measurable in destroyed aircraft and dead pilots. The bomber crews who flew through the killing fields over Germany and Japan during 1944 and 1945 never had certainty of survival. Better gunnery didn't make them invulnerable. Flak still filled the sky with shrapnel. German fighters still pressed attacks home despite improved defensive fire. Men still died in burning aircraft or frozen at altitude with their blood pooling on the fuselage floor. But the odds shifted slightly in their favor, and in warfare, small shifts in probability accumulate into survival or death. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.